In previous lectures, we have seen that there's a number of possible ways in which populations can grow. One of the simplest examples that we considered was the logistic system. Now remember that the idea was that they have a population that grows proportional to its actual number of individuals with a restriction of overgrowth that is related to the fact that we have limited resources, either space, nutrients, whatever it is. I took the simplest case where the carrying capacity is 1, so that I just have this normalized logistic growth. And remember that for this system, the idea is that I grow until I achieve saturation, okay? My 1 here, which is an attractor of all the possible trajectories that I can have in the system. Very good. For that system, when we analyze the stability, we saw that 0 is an unstable equilibrium point, right? So anything close to 0 departs and goes quickly to 1, whereas 1 is a stable equilibrium point. Trajectories go there and remain there, right? And any perturbation goes back to that state, okay? All right, there's an extra phenomenon that happens to occur in many natural systems and has, as you will see, implications for bioengineering, which is called the Allee effect. The Allee effect is observed, for example, in ecology and is well known from many years ago, that you need a minimal number of individuals to actually have a group that is able to persist in time and grow. That happens from ant colonies, where small colonies are more prone to disappear, to groups of starlings, birds that flock together, and that acts as an anti-predator strategy, right? So size of the group is relevant to actually make the group successful. And more generally, we can say that if there's some particular feature that involves a group level selection, you need a minimal group size to actually be able to grow over time. That has been observed in a number of contexts, and in recent years has been particularly observed, for example, in the growth of cancer, right? A very important problem in achieving successful cancer therapies has to do with something that for a long time has been neglected because lack of data, essentially, which is small tumors. What happens when you start to actually grow, right? And it seems to be an Allee effect involved. Right? The Allee effect meaning that unless you have an enough initial size, right, you might not succeed in keep going, right? To make the long story short, if the population is below a given threshold, you die, right? You cannot succeed because you either are not able to defend yourself or you are not able, as a group, to generate some particular feature that is needed for every individual to live. Whereas if you go beyond a given threshold, right, you can grow. So that's the essential idea. And what we are going to see is that because of the Allee effect, very interesting phenomena occur. Okay? Remember for the logistic system that if you plot growth rate, okay, which has this particular form, against x, okay, this is a parabola, right? So essentially goes this way, okay? This is 0, this is my carrying capacity 1 here, okay? In all this domain, this derivative is positive, meaning that in all this domain you grow, right? You grow quickly here, you grow less here, right? We know consistently with the way we achieve this state. And if you go beyond this point, right, you put more population that the carrying capacity, the population will shrink, okay? Going back into, let me do this, going back into this point. Actually, we can write down this, and this will be my unstable fixed point, and this is my stable fixed point, okay? So how we can model the Allee effect? There are essentially two kinds of Allee effects, right? One is the one that we're going to analyze now, is the strong Allee effect, okay? And mathematically, it goes as follows. We need a condition that ensures mathematically something like this, so that I grow and saturate, but they have an extra condition, right? That's going to happen provided that my population goes beyond the threshold, beyond this value here, right? So that's why we say, we talk about critical thresholds. So a way of defining that is as follows. I have a growth rate proportional to the number of individuals. That has to be always the case. Now I add an extra term. All right? So that would be the saturation, right? We know that. The growth. And that's the condition that we impose, saying that if x is larger than xc, the minimal number, right? The threshold condition, this is positive, and so I guarantee expansion of the population. If this is less than xc, this is negative, and that means that my population is going to shrink, right, to extinction. Okay? That's what we call the strong Allee effect. If I plot the same figure here, right, you can check out that. What I have now, right, my growth rate goes as follows. Now, there's a negative part, okay? So that would be xc, right, critical threshold. This would be 0, it would be 1, right? Nothing really different in this side, right? But in this part, I have population decay, right? My population shrinks over time. That's negative, and this part is positive. All right? Very good. Well, if I perform the stability analysis of this system, right, it's easy to show that I have 2 points that are stable, 1 point that is unstable, right? We have already worked on that when we explored symmetry breaking, but you will see the differences here also. The fixed points are easy to find because this is already factorized, right? So clearly this my trivial extinction point. Let's call it xc will be simply my critical threshold, and then this saturation state, right? Okay, if you perform the stability analysis of this, you will show, you can do it easily, that this is stable, that this is stable, right? Kind of a logistic, but there's a point in the middle that is unstable, okay? Very good. We can explore this using the potential function. And here the potential function is especially useful as an intuitive tool to actually see a little bit what's going on in my system and what are the implications. Remember that the potential function is constructed as minus the integral of the function that defines the dynamics of my system, right? Sometimes some people just write this, okay? It's another way of doing that, okay? But my form is known, right? If you calculate that, I'll give you the result in case you want to have it. In this particular case, the potential function looks like this. All right? Okay. If you plot this function, right, and that's an exercise for you, what you find is the following. Remember that the potential function has minima corresponding to equilibrium stable fixed points and maxima in unstable ones, right? You can show that the function here looks like this. Has a minimum at 0, right? Consistently with the idea that unless you have enough population, you go down to extinction, and then the potential goes like this. They're typically asymmetric, right? This is a stable fixed point. This is a stable fixed point, right? As I choose carrying capacity, this is one. And we have an extra. Let me write it with an open circle, okay? Unstable fixed point, a stable fixed point that separates actually two domains, okay? As usual, this is forbidden negative part, okay? But you see, there's, as it happened with the symmetry breaking, there's a whole set of initial conditions that will go to one point and a set of initial conditions that will go to another point, right? We didn't define that last time, but in dynamical systems, we call to all the initial conditions that go to a given point, we call it the basin of attraction, right? So from here, formally to infinity, anything that is within this domain, all right, will be the basin of attraction of this state, right? You can call it like this. Whereas in this part, right, the meaningful basin of attraction will be this one. All right. Well, you see immediately that the potential function is telling the story that provided that you cross this boundary, right, you spontaneously go into this state, right? High population, saturation. But if you go below this point, things are not going to go well, right? You will go into extinction. There are a number of points to be made here, right? And one is the following. In terms of trajectories, right, how the system goes in dynamically, to compare with that, right? If you are in this side here, what you see, in fact, let me write down here kind of all possible dynamical states. This would be saturation, extinction, and somewhere there's a threshold condition, right? Anything that starts below this value goes here to extinction, right? So if I run simulations, I will observe this, right? Okay? Everything that is beyond this term, if it's enough population, is going to go in this direction, okay? So you have two attractors, right? Very distinct, right? That depend on the presence of this threshold. This, also in dynamical systems, sometimes is called metastable states. We'll go for that when we go into mathematical neurobiology. But it's important to mention a number of points. One is that I plot this potential in this way, right? But for parameter values that get this closer, right? When you have xc values that may be closer to 1, you need a strong requirement, okay? It might be that the potential also flattens, right? And then if you have fluctuations in any place, right, you can jump from one side to the other. We'll go for that in another lecture, okay? That is essentially what defines the strong Allee effect, okay? But that's not the only situation, and we'll consider, as extensions of this, okay, two more scenarios. In one, we'll think about an Allee effect, this is the so-called weak Allee effect, where this condition is not necessary. And we'll connect that with something we already studied here, hyperbolic growth. And secondly, we'll see that if we think in terms of therapies, in terms, for example, of cancer therapies, right, the Allee effect has a profound implication, and it turns out to be far beyond cancer therapy, and we can actually consider its application into something like planetary terraformation. So we have seen that the Allee effect, as defined here by the strong form, shows that dynamically we can actually explain why populations that have not overcome a given threshold in terms of the number of individuals are not able to succeed. There is an implication of this that might have interesting consequences in the context of cancer. You will see more examples of mathematics of cancer growth in relation with critical sizes. But one important lesson that might be extracted from here, and we'll go back to that, is that if you are under a limited population size, right, just because you cannot overcome the threshold, you might get extinct, right? And that has consequences for potential therapies. Well, that's one way of building this Allee effect. There's a second way of doing that, right? This is the strong Allee effect, right? But you can use something that we already saw here, right, in the context of cooperation. Remember that at some point we mentioned that cooperation means that you need to have individuals interacting, okay? And that allows to describe an Allee effect, okay, in the following way. You again have growth, it's a given rate, right? But now the growth is dependent on interactions. So I need pairwise interactions, right, affecting the encounter of individuals. In a way, what we are saying mathematically is that there's some kind of closeness that has to happen to facilitate growth, right? We saw this without the control term when we analyzed hyperbolic growth, and now we actually have this part here, right? So we use a cooperative term, not a threshold, right? Why is this also a Allee effect like? Okay, well, that's an exercise for you to do the whole mathematical analysis, okay? But if we actually plot this function, right, to see how this works, what we will find out is the following. We have a saturation term, so somewhere it has to grow exactly like the logistic system, right? More or less. But we have this term here, and remember that we have hyperbolic growth, a very slow growth rate at the beginning for small populations. And essentially what happened here is that there's a strong asymmetry, right? Where here the growth rate effectively pretty close to zero is almost none, it's almost zero, right? Why there's an Allee effect here? Well, because if you are close to this very small population value, fluctuations, something that we still haven't included in our mathematical formalism because it's an advanced topic, fluctuations here can really threaten survival, right? Small amount of individuals under an external environment that can actually randomly kill some of them is effectively not different from this, okay? So it's your part of your homework to analyze the stability of this system, find out the potential function, see what's the differences, right, which are quite important. But again, close to this domain, I'm likely to have a hard time to survive as a population, right? I really need to go beyond some threshold. Actually, if there were some kind of measure of the size of the environmental fluctuations affecting extinction, right, something that could actually define some effective stochastic threshold, we can actually make a complete analogy from this case. All right? Very good. There's a final extension that I want to make that has, as you will see, very important consequences, right, to population dynamics, and I could say beyond that, which is the following. Now, it's an extension that considers the dynamics of the Allee effect plus something else kind of connected with what I was saying here, right? Imagine I have this part of the dynamics, and I include now an extra term, right? An extra death term, right? That, as you can see, is the linear decay term that we already analyzed when we did exponential decay, right? So I have weak Allee effect, and then decay. How different is this? How interesting is this? And it's extremely interesting. I can interpret that in a number of ways. My first interpretation is the following. Suppose that this is a cancer growing population, right, where there is a cooperative effect that is necessary, right? As I was mentioning at some point, evidence from clinical data suggests that this might be the case, that small tumors need some cooperative effects going on, right? Critical populations need to be achieved to actually expand into a full-fledged tumor. And now, right, in the same context, imagine that what I put here is a therapy, right? Chemotherapy, for example, something that targets cells proportional to the amount of population that you have there, right? What is the consequence of that? And once again, it's extremely interesting to see how this simple dynamical system can trigger phenomena, right, that are counterintuitive. To analyze that, we can do several things. I leave to you again analyzing the potential function. One thing we can do is to actually calculate the fixed points of this system. You see it's a cubic system. You'll have 3 fixed points. The trivial one, as usual. You can see that if I remove one x here to get this point, I have a second order equation that I can use and calculate two points that are write this. Okay, just solve the second order equation. All right, kind of resembles a little bit also what we saw in symmetry breaking, right? A given point and then 2 symmetric things. Not exactly the same thing here, but the way of seeing the whole repertoire of things that happen here, the best thing to do is to write down the bifurcation diagram, right? The bifurcation diagram, remember, is a diagram that contains almost everything that happens in my dynamical system. To do it, I need to choose one parameter, and I'm going to choose delta, okay? The delta parameter, which in terms of if you're thinking in cancer therapy, will be the efficiency of the chemotherapy, right? To remove cancer cells linearly, right? And so I will have a competition between the processes that are defined here. In my bifurcation diagram, as usual, I will plot my fixed points, okay? And what I can find here is the following. See, for example, when delta is 0, I'm going in the weak Allee effect, nothing else, there's no therapy here. Delta will be 0, okay? Forget about this, and the only things I have is 0 and 1, right? Actually, this point already have here, 1 and 0, okay? Important thing to say, I didn't say that, but this is stable, right? You may say stable, it's always stable, but how is that possible? But remember that this stable local linear stability means that close to this point, you go to this point as an attractor, right? And what else I can say here? Well, see, actually these points here, these 2 potential states, only exist, right, if what is within the square root is positive, right? Otherwise, I'm going to the complex numbers, non-realistic in terms of population dynamics. So there's one condition that actually emerges here that is useful to actually guide things, right? I need that to be larger than 0, right? Which actually goes into the condition that to actually have these points, for these points to exist, okay, I need delta to be less than a critical value that is nothing but this, right? Below this threshold, they exist. And actually, if you plot them, that would be delta C, all right? Right when they are exactly at this critical value, right? This is 1/2. What you can show doing stability analysis again, right, is that these correspond to the positive branch, right? That's what it's called usually, positive branch, which is stable, right? This, the negative, is totally symmetric and corresponds to the negative branch and is unstable. And remember that we decided to use the picture, so using discontinuous lines to indicate that this is unstable, right? Exists, but is unstable, and 0 is here, which is always stable, okay? Meaning what? Meaning the following. First, 0 is always stable, but of course, you need to have a minimum population size, right? Because if it goes beyond this actual negative branch, everything reverses, right? Because this is actually stable, right? So essentially I go from stable, unstable, stable. And actually it's something that it's an intuitive guidance for when you do the analysis. If you have, for example, 3 points like here, 3 fixed points, there has to be consistency, right? It cannot be something like this is stable, this is unstable, or things like that, right? It has to be consistent. So, things to mention. 1, there's a special point here, right? This is a tipping point, okay? I made my population grow constantly, I made my decay or death rate grow constantly, all right? And if I observe the population, what I will see is that I move continuously here, right? Imagine my marble, if you want, right? It's not a potential function, right? But I move here, down, 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 down. And at this point, even if I continuously increase that, I shift catastrophically into the extinction state, right? So, continuous change in a given parameter doesn't mean that the system reacts in a continuous way, right? Extremely important lesson that you will see also in a seminar in a different context, all right? Secondly, if you analyze the potential function, right, you will see that the behavior of this function actually maps very well this kind of result, right? For example, imagine that you are here, okay? Far away from the tipping point, but the potential function has more or less, right, this shape, okay? And just writing it qualitatively, you have to do the calculation. Meaning that 2 states are possible, right? And that all depends whether or not I'm below this value, or beyond this value, up there, right? As I get close to the transition, what happens with my function, this potential function, is that it gets change, right? So when I go close here, let me see if I can write it here, right, this level. What I will see is that, you see, I still have this state. Imagine that it started here, right? The potential function actually deforms, right? And what happens is that maybe, right? I'm still here, okay? But as I get approaching this point, this starts to go like this, right? So my marble keeps there, right? It could be very close to here, right? I'm still there, but small perturbations can actually make me jump suddenly, right, into this state. And when I'm ready to close this, right, and again you can actually show that, right, what I have is this, right, maybe some faint reminder that there was a stable point there, but there's no stable point anymore, okay? So that's kind of the sequence of events that happens here when I move across the bifurcation diagram, right? Again, consequences for two important systems. In the context of what I was mentioning there, right, imagine that this, in a way, is a simplified model of cancer therapy, assuming that the cancer population grows involving cooperative effects, right? What this is saying is that once I cross a threshold, right, everything will be wiped out, right? Despite that I might have a population there, right, that is there, okay, that's not feasible to be sustainable anymore, all right? We have used that in a very different context, right? And I want to stress the importance of thinking using mathematical models in more universal ways, right? It's not mathematical model for a single system. This situation here happens to occur in a totally different class of system, right? In ecological systems that are called drylands, right? It might seem strange that I'm going to talk about ecology in the context of biomedical research, but actually ecosystems in many ways have analogies with organisms, right? And people actually talks about geophysiology as a way of thinking in planetary dynamics within the context of a living planet, right? In drylands, we find out a very similar situation. Actually, we can make models of that, right? Where essentially you have this and these terms. What is the meaning here? Well, the meaning here is if I have vegetation, right? I'm just going to change the name of the variable, right? It is known that there's a phenomenon that's called facilitation, right? Facilitation is this. Facilitation means that if I'm here, I'm a plant, and I have a neighbor, right? So we do interact because we are close. My presence facilitates your survival, right? In other words, in mathematical terms, interactions, right, make easier for the population to actually grow. But that involves then that kind of nonlinearity, right? And then what's this? These are external effects, right, that act removing populations, right? And one particular way of doing that is aridity, right? The fact that hydric stress, high temperatures, and that's important for global warming, is going to increase that, right? So what happened here? Mathematically, it's exactly the same, right? In other words, if I increase aridity, right, or some kind of stress in the system, what I'm going to see, and that's unfortunately what is going to happen within this century, right? I'm going to jump from what? From vegetation cover, right? That will be my ecosystem state where I have plants, right? To a tipping point that goes into what? Into a desert, right? That's what in the literature is called green desert transitions. So, two important points, final points to be made. One, the importance of understanding the nonlinear nature of ecological, and in general, biological interactions, right? Because it makes a strong difference. We could think that if you wait in time, things are going to change smoothly. In other words, my intuition will be if stress increases, I should go like this. I have less and less and less population, maybe just going down and down. That's not the case, right? Complex systems typically exhibit tipping points. Very important to think in terms of the risk in the future. And the other thing is that we've been working on that, thinking in how can we prevent that from happening? And here is where bioengineering comes to our help, right? We have proposed the idea that we'll see in some seminar that we can use strategies to perform what's called terraformation, what we call terraformation in the context of modifying living ecosystems that might be close to tipping points, right, that could experience catastrophic transitions, right, using engineering. In particular, using synthetic biology. In other words, that's the big picture, right? Could we actually modify the way interactions take place here in such a way that we exploit the same nonlinearities to push the system far away from the tipping point, right? And that's a lot of lessons that we might learn and that connect, as you can see, the small-scale dynamics of cancer, for example, within our bodies to the large-scale dynamics, not less, no more than the planetary level.